So when we talk about the Cold War, coming out of World War II, there are two particular conflicts that are of major importance. The first one is the North and South Korea conflict. In fact, technically speaking, this has actually never ended. This is the longest going military conflict that the United States has been a part of. There has not actually ever been an end to what we call the Korean War. Um, how did this happen? Well, on the 25th of June in 1950, a group of North Korean soldiers crossed with 100,000 men, 1,400 pieces of artillery, 126 tanks. They crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. These North Koreans were equipped and funded and supported by Russian communists. And so this began the conflict in Korea. America, underneath the command of General MacArthur, actually did a landing in Korea. We engaged in a very rapid and quick conflict and reestablished a separation between South and North Korea at the DMZ on the 38th parallel, which has been the demarcation between North Korea and South Korea ever since that point. It is interesting to consider, as somebody who's a religious historian, that for whatever reason, South Korea, coming out of this major conflict during the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s, had a massive evangelical resurgence and revival. The Presbyterian Church became extremely strong in South Korea, and also so did the Charismatic Church. In fact, some of the largest churches in the entire world are found in South Korea, and a lot of South Koreans who feel called to ministry or to academic ministry of some sort travel to America and study in America because of the fact that there were American missionaries who had massive influence in Korea. Alongside that, the industry and the commerce of capitalistic South Korea has been very strong. All the way through this period, they have been one of the thriving, strong nations that benefited greatly from the Truman Doctrine. Now, another conflict that was also of great significance during the 1950s and 1960s is the conflict that took place in North and South Korea. What you have here is you have the North Korean forces that are allying themselves with other communistic forces in South Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and the North Korean Army, the North Vietnam Army, take a long march using the Cambodian buffer to be able to enter into Vietnam and to cause conflict and cause trouble. Throughout this time period, the Americans believed that it was incredibly important to defend South Vietnam and keep it capitalistic and keep it protected from these forces, these combined forces, the communistic South Vietnamese armies and also the North Vietnam Army. That line, that march, is called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and of course, one of the important events that took place coming out of this was the fall of Saigon eventually, and where American forces and Americans that were present and occupying in South Vietnam actually had to evacuate, and that was a miserable failure for the Americans. The long-standing conflict in North and South Vietnam ended up being a very troublesome spot for the American Republic throughout the 50s and the 60s, and it was an area of much protest that took place. We have to remember that It was primarily the Americans that were involved, but they were actually coming to the support of the French because Vietnam had once been a French colony. And so the French were also involved in this conflict as well, trying to offer support for the capitalistic South Vietnam. Another conflict that was really important during this whole era of the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. You have the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which Cuban missiles that are ballistic missiles are found in Cuba. With the partnership of Russia, they have been able to be imported to Cuba. And these ballistic missiles have the range to be able to hit American cities. And so it became a very huge conflict. This was a conflict that JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, president at the time, was at the very center of handling the diffusion of this conflict between the Americans, the Russians, and the Cubans. Ultimately, the crisis is averted, and there isn't a launch. There also isn't a major conflict that takes place, but it was very dicey for a period of time. Propaganda and fear were two elements that were very significant in the Cold War. As you recall, the major enemies of the Cold War stood between the USSR and the United States. And so throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, particularly in the 80s, the early 80s, at the very height of the conflict and the tension in the Cold War, you have a lot of messages that are taking place through the use of media. One of those classic ones is the story of Rocky IV, where you have Rocky Balboa going up against the Russian boxer, and you have the underdog who is kind of purebred, Rocky, who is using just human techniques to prepare himself and to fight, versus this Russian that's using all sorts of technology and all sorts of funding in order to prepare for the fight. And it becomes this very symbolic fight between America and Russia, where America ends up winning ultimately. Then you also have the story of Red Dawn, where you have Korean and you have Russian troops that are landing in continental United States, and there is this first major conflict that is taking place in the United States, and American citizens are having to engage in guerrilla warfare. And so this is the story of some teens that live in the Rocky Mountains who are trying, actually they're in Spokane, Washington, are trying to protect their community and their families from these communistic forces that are there. This is all propaganda messaging that's built on fear, that's trying to help Americans understand the intensity of the situation that's taking place. And then you also have this form of this movie, War Games, with Matthew Broderick, where you have this young genius boy that is helping think through these different global catastrophic scenarios of weapons of mass destruction and what's going to take place if different launch sequences are taking place, happen. All of this is part of the propaganda messaging that is taking place in the midst of the Cold War. Perhaps the last symbolic event that took place during the Cold War was the Miracle on Ice, where you have the United States facing off against the Russians in the 1980 Olympics, and the Americans miraculously defeat the more than likely to win victorious Russians who have always dominated the ice. This was another one of those very propagandistic, symbolic moments of the Cold War for the American people. Ultimately, the Cold War finds its end 9 years later, after the Miracle on Ice, when the Berlin Wall is taken down. This is after Ronald Reagan has famously said, Gorbachev, tear down that wall. And so the wall ends up being torn down. The East and Western Berlin no longer is separated, and the people are united. and you end up having the end of the Cold War itself. The Cold War ends up being this very symbolic and important event that has to do with the contention between two major ideologies, communism and capitalism. And so we have been able to trace much of this. We're also going to look next time at globalism and technology and terrorism, and how those different tropes that take place during the second half of the 20th century and on into the 21st century have major ideological influences on the capitalism communism tension and the overall sense of identity of the global market.